Hello. Uh, I wanted to just go over this project that I set up, which is I'm calling it a React router template. It's got React set up, it's got React router set up. The one thing that's missing from here is Redux. And one of the things that I wanted to do is show you that you don't necessarily have to use Redux to create a React application. And sometimes um, Redux could even be more than you need for an application. And I think one of the things that happens is that if you sort of take Redux out of the equation, it might sort of help you understand what's happening with React and what's happening with Redux, what Redux is, and ends up getting used for. And even the person that ended up creating Redux has a blog post about the fact that you don't necessarily need Redux for a React application. So just to sort of go over this functionality here, I've got a home page, I've got a products page, I've got a login page, I've got three users. I've got Mo with the login of Mo, and you can see that Mo is up here. And in fact, I could go to products, I could refresh the page, and you can see that Mo is still logged in. I could go to settings, I could change Mo to you know, Big Mo. And if I update settings, notice that this will end up popping up here at the top. If I attempt to use a username that's already taken, since these are going to be unique, and I go over here and I say Larry, you'll see that this gives me an error message. So let me actually switch this back so I remember. Switch this back to Mo. And let's take a look and see what the structure of the application is. So server side, not all that much happening that's different from anything that we've looked at before. We've got a number of routes that are set up, some of these not actually even being used. We've got this ability to authenticate a user. And what this ends up doing is basically we're using token authentication. We look for a user with a username and a password that's passed in here. If we end up finding them, we end up sending back a token, and that token will immediately end up getting exchanged for a user. So this is something that we've actually seen before. If I actually log out the user, I clear this out, and I go over here and I log in, you're going to actually see two XHR requests here. If I go Mo and Mo, you'll see one of them is going to give me the token, which I get back. And you'll see the other one is actually going to go and give me back the user. And again, this should be tweaked a bit. There's way too much information that's coming back on the user. We don't really need to pass the password back here, although we actually are using it here in the settings. Probably not the best practice. But those are the main methods that we have here. And if we go and take a look at the React part of the application, we've got our index, which is nothing all that different than we've seen before. But again, you see no Redux, you see no provider. You have our three pages that are here. There's no concept of a store. These are individual paths that we have. And the bottom line is that we're not going to use some universal store. What we're going to end up using is we're going to use various services to end up getting the data that we end up needing. One of the things about Redux, which is nice, is that Redux basically allows you to have this store that's hang around there as you navigate between these pages in this single page application. And the fact is, it remembers your data as you end up going through there. So one of the patterns that I'm going to show you in a second, let's start out with something fairly simplistic here. Let's look at one of our components. So we've got this products page, and this is fairly simplistic. The thing that's missing here that you don't have, that you would have in a Redux application, is be using Connect to connect your store, but you don't have a store here. Instead, what we have is a service, and we'll take a look at that service. But one of the things that we can guess from this is that our service is going to ask for products. We end up getting the products, and then we end up setting them to the state. And here I'm just using this underscore here. So we've got this products page, which is our DOM component. This is the one that if you looked at, you could tell everything that's going on here. We've got products that are passed in here, and we're just looping over them to get our list items. So when our component ends up mounting, we end up calling get products. Now, what's interesting about this, and we'll look at this again later, I'm going to reload this. And you'll see that we've made a call for our products. And in fact, this is our products that we're getting here. But notice that if I go over here and I go back to home and I go back to products, notice that there's no new call for products. This is the same one that we had before. If I clear this, just to show you, go here, you can see that it's not making a call. And I'm actually using a pattern here. And if I go and we take a look at this product service, and I look at this product service, it's a pretty simple service. But what I call this is really a lazy promise. And what happens here is that I've got this products promise, and let's actually even look and see what we're exporting first. We're exporting just one method, get products, but we're closing over this variable. And of course, the first time we call it, we're not going to have a products promise. And what we're going to do is we're going to set products promise equal to this promise. That means that the next time that we ended up calling get products, we would have a promise that was there ready. In other words, this works assuming that we don't end up changing our products. If we changed our products, then we would want to do something which is basically any number of things, either basically say, hey, look, this underscore products promise is now null, so the next time you ask for products, go back to the database again. In fact, if we wanted to just sort of fake this, if I say non underscore products or true, okay, now if I end up going back here and I'm reloading this, if I reload this page, I'll see that every time that I end up going to the products page, it's going to go and make that call to my product. Again, this is not a huge deal if you did that. If you didn't end up, what I would say is caching this promise. And again, just sort of think about the scenario. Let's say you called this, on two different components. There's only going to be one promise. If that promise has been set, it's going to return that promise. If not, it's going to instantiate that promise, and it'll end up returning it. So in other words, you're saving multiple calls to the database. So that's one pattern that you have going on here. Now things get a little bit more complicated when we start looking at some other objects. And let me just mention one other thing here. This sort of pattern that we have here for our products page, this is perfectly legitimate to have here. The only thing that our page is depending upon are these products, and we'll operate under the assumption that these products are not changing while the user is looking at this page. If there was some other part of the application where the products could be changing, for instance, if in fact there was a form here that allowed you to insert a new product and you could do it up here, while this page was still sitting here, then you would need to do something else to let this part of the application know about that change. And we have an example of that. So let's take a look at something a little bit more interesting. Let's take a look at our login page. Okay. So our login page is actually going to log the user into the site. And our login page is, in fact, you can see our dumb component, you can see our smart component down here. We've got a state for name, we've got a state for password. We've got an on change that's just making sure that we can modify these two input fields. Instead of doing on change name and on change password, I basically have put these into one method so that I have this change object, which will get the name of the thing that I'm changing. In this case, it would be name. In this case, it would be password. And so I basically would either set my state to name equals whatever the target value is, or password, whatever the target value is. When I go to log the user into the site, what I'm doing here is I'm going to ask my auth service, which is another service, a bit more complicated. I'm going to pass in the state. The state is basically the credentials. And if in fact I'm successful, I'm going to end up going to the products page. If I'm not successful, I'm going to set an error equal to true, in which case I'll have this warning show up, bad username and password. And we could take a look at this. I'm going to log the user out. And if I log the user in and I say Mo, and I'll do Mo in lowercase, right? That's not going to work if I do Mo in uppercase. Now, the thing that's critical here is that after I log in the user to the site, my nav is going to end up changing. And this is a scenario where something is happening in and out of the component, and I really need to change the state of this component as a result of this changing. So now if I call login, I'll see that I have Mo up here, and that's really where the complexity ends up coming in. If this were an application that had something called two-way data binding, what you could do is you could have this top nav component know about the logged in user, and when the logged in user ended up changing because you logged in, this would change accordingly. But React doesn't have two-way model binding. With React, you have to be very explicit, and you have to have some way of letting this nav know that your state has ended up changing, that something has changed, and this should end up looking for a new state, and you should end up rendering the new state. And let's take a look and see how that's done. So there's two things that are going on here. Let's try to tease these things apart a little bit. I've got this nav component. Okay, now if you look at this nav component, there's a number of things that are being passed in here. Number of products, user, and log out. And in fact, if I don't have a user, I put a login link. Otherwise, I have a log out link, and I also have some settings that I allow the user to get to. Now let's just see a couple of things that end up happening here. Okay. One of the things that's happening is that I have something called a pub sub service. And this is really one of the things that you have to do. And this stuff is really happening to some degree behind the scenes when you're using Redux, is to basically say, hey, look, I'm interested in something happening in my application. And when something happens, I expect that something will be published, and I would like to subscribe to it. So what you're seeing here in this pub sub service is you're seeing that we want to subscribe to this login type. We're passing in also a function. This function will end up getting a user, at least that's what we're expecting, and we're going to set the state of the user with this. We also are returning from here a function which would give us the ability to unsubscribe. We don't really have to. The reason why we don't have to is because this component is sitting here all the time. If it wasn't, then we would basically have the need to unsubscribe to it. So let's just see what happens here. I'm going to go, and first I'm going to log out, because there's some other stuff in here that I want to talk about, and they're really different things. I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to get rid of this. I'm going to comment this subscribe, and we'll look at this service in a second. It's actually quite simplistic. I'll go in here, and I'm going to log in. And what you'll see is if I go over here and I say Mo, and I log in, let me actually just refresh that one more time. Let me log out. So I think it might not have totally run. If I go Mo and Mo, you'll see here that it's not showing that I'm logged in. Okay? If I put this back in here, wait a second, make sure it builds. I'm going to log out, and I'll go in here and I'll log in again. Now it ends up working. So let's talk about what that subscribe ends up doing. And we'll talk about what this does here, which is actually something that's a little bit different. Obviously, you could see them actually using my product service again to get my products, because I want to show them up here. But let's look and see what this subscribe function does. So if we look at our pub sub service, it's really incredibly short. And all the pub sub service says is that it has two things that it could do. We can publish, and we can subscribe to it. When we want to subscribe to it, we pass in a subscriber, and we push that subscriber here, and we actually pass back a function, and what that function will end up doing is that when it's called, and if it's called, it'll basically get rid of that subscriber. Okay, again, if the component were unmounting, we would end up needing it. When we want to publish, what we do is we pass a type here. We loop over all of our subscribers, and if that subscriber is interested in this type, we take the subscriber that has a function and we end up passing this data. So how does that all work? Well, let's take a look, and we're going to take a look at our auth service, which is doing the publishing. This is a little bit more work that's here, but we've got this attempt login. We pass in credentials. Okay, again, remember this is a two-part thing. We end up posting. We end up looking for a response. Okay, when we end up getting a response, we actually take this token and we end up putting it in local storage. And then what we're going to do is we're going to exchange that token for a user. The exchange token for a user grabs the token. I end up looking if there's a token, and here I'm doing that same lazy loading that I did before with the products, which basically says, hey, look, you know what? I'm going to use this exchange token for user on a number of different pages within my application. If I already have a user in the system or on the browser, I don't want to keep on going back and forth and getting one. That's why you end up seeing here that here I am on the home page. If I go to the settings page, I'm not making another call to get the user because, in fact, I have this user promise already. The main thing is really that what ends up happening is that when I make that call and I exchange the token for a user, then I publish. And so basically, I end up getting my user back here and I publish the user. And what's happening there is that if I started out on, I'll log out here. So again, if I go over here and I log in and I go over here and I type in Mo, okay? What's going to happen is I'm going to end up hitting my auth service. Again, since its username and password is correct, my auth service is going to end up publishing a login and passing in that user. So when I log in up here, it ends up the nav service, the nav component subscribes and ends up getting that user. So just a couple of other points that are kind of worth noting here. You've got this pub sub method, but there's something else that you're also seeing in the nav bar. Okay, you're also seeing that when the app ends up loading, what I should say is when this component is loaded, I'm going to go and I'm going to tell the auth service. So these are doing two different things. If the user is already logged in, okay, if the user is already logged in, they have logged in before, in other words, that token ends up existing. So this would end up being used for a hard reload. If there's a hard reload and the user ended up logging in, what ends up happening is I end up exchanging the token for the user. If I took this out, everything would work okay, except I'm going to log out here, reload. Everything would work okay, except when I go to log in now, things will look good, and I could navigate over here, right? I could navigate to settings. Again, notice that it's not making that call to get the user because that user promise is already fulfilled. We can take a look at that on the settings page. But notice if I do a hard reload, if I end up doing a hard reload, it doesn't remember that I'm logged in. So again, in an application, you want to basically keep the user logged in on a hard reload. I think that makes sense. I think people would complain if you didn't have that. So that's what this call ends up doing. This goes and, goes over here. And if we look at the auth service, I'm calling exchange token for a user. If there's no token, that's fine. And again, one thing about this is that even if I called this multiple times, here's a good example of actually seeing this. If I end up going to my nav and I go back over here, even if I called this method twice, it doesn't matter how many times I called it. I'm just going to put a then here, console.log, and I'll just log out the user. So this is going to return that user promise if, in fact, there's a token that ends up existing. So what I should see here, if I do a hard reload, so I do a hard reload, notice here, this is my call to exchange the token for the user. Notice it only ended up getting called once, but I still have my data here. In fact, I could call that really as many times as I want to. And again, if it's a satisfied promise, and I go back over here, let's just sort of prove this to ourselves. Let's do it a couple of times and give this a chance to reload. So even though I'm going to see user a bunch of times here, if I go back to my network tab just to prove this to you again, I reload this, I'll only see that one call where it's exchanging the token for the user, and that's a result of the fact, let me actually take these off now so I don't forget to. And that's really a result of the fact that on the auth service, I am caching this user promise. Now, again, it's important that, if you do something like that, that you make sure that you have the ability to update the user as well. And that's why when I have this update user method, which I'm calling from this settings page. So on this settings page, what I'm doing here is, again, I need to get the user. I ask for the promise for the username and password. And then I have this auth service, update user. Again, I've got my state. This is very, very similar to what you had in the login page. But when that update user ends up getting called, notice that one of the things that I do is that, I go in here and I say, hey, look, was I able to update the user? And if I am able to update the user, then let me just be clear and say, hey, look, you know what, that user promise is now null. And in fact, I'm going to call exchange token for user again, and I'm going to call publish again. And that's the reason why, again, if we took this out, and I went back over here, and I'll reload this, and I go over here and I change this to Big Mo, and I update it. You won't end up seeing the update here. You'll see it when I end up reloading the page. But if you wanted to see it there, you just need to make sure to publish your event with the pub/sub service. And if I go over here and now I change this back to Mo, you'll see, since I put that back in, you'll end up seeing it update here. So again, what you're seeing here is, first of all, you don't really have the need to have this store. You could just call services. You're probably going to want to do something like I'm doing here. Again, simply example by saying, hey, look, if I already have the products, I don't really want to get them again. So some way of basically doing what I'm calling really a lazy loading of a promise. Granted, things like logging in and auth service get to be a little bit more complicated, probably more on the client side than they do on the server. The nice part about that is you only have to do that once with an application. But again, if you're not going to have something like Redux, you're going to have something that lets other components know that something has changed in the application, and the place that we're using it, really the only place at this point, is our nav bar to just specify, hey, look, in fact, if we have, and this is probably not even the right name for it, but we're interested in a login. Really what this is, we're interested in the user when the user ends up getting loaded, or again, we're calling that when the user ends up getting changed, and when that happens, we end up setting the state, or else this component would never have an idea. And again, the reason why it works in Redux is that Redux is keeping track of the state and saying, hey, look, has there been a change to these objects, and calls this these connect methods, and so you have the updated objects that are getting passed through as props from the map state to props. And that's what I wanted to really go over.